If we look at the sea of horror games that were released on the PlayStation, there were many distinctive and yet interesting ideas. While not all of them were considered mainstream or would even reach the heights of success that would have been seen with the likes of the Resident Evil and Silent Hill series, they all presented something different and unique that in many ways allowed them to stand out from the crowd. But a lot of these concepts are distinctive only to that game that have never been seen outside of it since. But other ideas, you do see them in the more mainstream, more modern rendition of video games today, but still an interesting characteristic to revisit. So when we look at Martian Gothic, Unification, it was developed by Talonsoft and published by Take-Two Interactive for the PC originally in the year 2000 and would later be ported to the PlayStation in 2001. They would act as a survival horror game in the same vein as the classic Resident Evil games, with the premise of the game taking on the role of 3 different players that end up on a space installation that have been asked to investigate 10 months of radio silence, and upon arrival, not too long after, they find that all of the crew members are now deceased or have been killed in some hideous or grotesque way, and with the majority of them now becoming reanimated corpses, turning them into bloodthirsty zombies. And one interesting dynamic with this is that yes, it is played from a fixed camera perspective using pre-rendered backgrounds, very similar to games like the classic Resident Evil series, with a similar control pattern and style even with the inventory systems, but the fluency of the controls and the dynamics of the movements aren't as fluent as the more mainstream games. They are a bit more on the clunkier side. But what's interesting about this is you can pick between any one of the 3 characters at any interval throughout the game, and they all have intertwining stories that help the whole dynamic of the entirety of the plot that surrounds the game. But one interesting mechanic that this game does represent that you've never seen before is the fact is that with all 3 characters, while you can switch between them at any time in the game, and you will need to do so to complete the many of the game's puzzles and unlock areas for other people to get into, you do have specific choices that will definitely hinder the progress, which will result in having different endings, as the game does have a few. But the most interesting aspect of the game is the fact is that you can never have any of the 3 characters ever together in the same room at any one time. And the reason behind this is that with the initial crew members now obviously being deceased, they would have been doing a lot of research, and they obviously stumbled across some form of artifact of unknown origin, and what it done was it created some form of a curse or some form of dynamic, something like that. And as a result is that any live human being, once it comes in contact with any other living life form, they end up being transformed into hideous and grotesque creatures, which as you later find in the game, there's some elements and areas that you'll explore that are literally home to some of the most hideous abominations that you will see in that era of video games, and there's no way of actually killing them. And what it is a combination of many people that have been all transformed, and they've somehow been all combined into one entity to become a massively hideous monster. And like I said, there's no way to take it out. The only thing you can do is to run away, and sometimes you don't even get that chance depending on different scenarios or choices that you make, which can result in the game having different endings. So in order to complete the game, while 3 enter the base, only 2 will ever leave, and the 2 that do leave are all dependent on your choices that you'll make throughout the game, because in order for 2 to survive, 1 has to sacrifice themselves. So you'll have to make that tough choice at the end of the game, and you'll find because you get more familiar and get more into the characters and the plot and even their backgrounds, you get to understand their backstories, you do develop somewhat of a bond with them, so you will find that final choice to be tough. It's an interesting dynamic that I've never seen in any other game since that really focuses on the emphasis of storytelling more to the point, and also focuses on the element of communication, as it is vital for the progression of each of the characters, at least until the end. It's just an interesting dynamic that really stood out. With that being said, when the game was released on the PlayStation, however, it was released primarily as a budget title because the console was in the last few years of its lifespan and there wasn't as many mainstream games coming out for it as such. But when it did release, both on the PC and on the PlayStation, it was met with mixed reviews, but there was some positives to take from it, and like I said, some of the gameplay dynamics and plots and scenes that were different, that you wouldn't see anywhere else. The fact is that it has a sci-fi aesthetic to it also adds to the appeal, and the game has a lot of diverse elements that does present a lot of really distinctive offerings that you really wouldn't get anywhere else, and you still probably won't even to this day. But it was let down sadly just because of certain elements, especially with the likes of the control systems and just certain interactive features that didn't play out the way that they probably should have done. But still, it's not the best survival horror game on the PlayStation, but it's definitely something that's different. It takes a lot of influence and inspiration from games that came before it, but it definitely adds its own pitch on proceedings on what it was trying to do. It has dynamics there that we've never seen since then, which definitely makes it worth a try. Now, if you're wanting to play the definitive version of it in terms of its visuals and overall dynamics, the PC version, if you could manage to get it working, would be the way to go. The PlayStation did have a significant downgrade, especially with the likes of the visuals and the textures, in order to make it run efficiently on the system. But it's not to say that it's a bad game. It's definitely worthy of the survival horror badge that it has earned, and it is an interesting title to play on the PlayStation. And the funny thing is, because it was released late on in the console's lifespan, it was never brought to mass appeal by many. If anything, the game has often been overlooked, and even in the more recent years, the game is still very rarely ever talked about, which is kind of weird. Like, I remember even going back, when I first found out about the game, I remember seeing previews in games magazines, and I thought it looked interesting, and sure, for me, the fact is that it looked like Resident Evil. I just wanted to play it. And I remember when I first seen it that it was being released solely for the PC, and I thought to myself that would be cool to see it on the PlayStation, but then to find out then a couple of years later, and that it did get a port on the PlayStation, I searched for ages, for months, even for a year or two to try and find a copy of it. Now, in saying that, I didn't actually get to play the game until at least 2003, 2004. Like, the game had been out a couple of years at this point before I managed to be able to find a copy of it, and I literally found it in a second-hand game store in my local town. It was a small shop. Now, it didn't last too long, but I remember finding it in the store for like about €8 at the time, so it was very cheap, and I couldn't believe my luck when I seen it. I picked it up and I was looking, I was like thinking to myself, this is the game I've been looking for ages, and I could never find it, because I do remember it, because I would have like a photographic memory, so when I see something that I like, I usually don't forget it, and I do remember seeing it. I was looking at it and I was like, yeah, that is the game I remember. And when I seen it for the price that was there, sure, I bought it straight away. I was just like, yeah, I can't very well not, because I was hunting it down for so long. Now, mind you, we did have a PlayStation 2 at the time, but I would still go back and play the PlayStation 1 a lot, especially when I found games like this out in the wilderness that I couldn't find anywhere else. I definitely would put a lot of time into it, and I did with this game. Now, I did manage to finish it, but let's just say it's tough and it's slow. It will take a long time to get through the game, because there's a lot of intricacies and a lot of things that will take time to figure out, especially with the puzzles and exploration elements. But you'll get there if you're persistent and you have patience. But I just love this style of game. This is my favourite style of horror game, in fairness. Regardless of the clunky elements of it, I'm still willing to give it a go, and they're not all that bad. But this is definitely an interesting title, and like I said, it's one that is worth looking into, especially if you want to understand more about the deep lore behind these original and classic survival horror games that were from that era, and especially on the PlayStation. So I'd love to know your thoughts of Martian Gothic Unification for the PlayStation, and what do you think of it overall, or did you originally play it even on the PC? It will be interesting to hear whatever thoughts you do have of the game, so be sure to share it down in the comments below. And if you would like to see more content around more types of games like this that were also released on the PlayStation, then you can leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, and you can check out this playlist here on screen to see more of those games in action. And as always, keep those gaming memories alive.